My son's business partner died mysteriously months ago. Yesterday, my daughter-in-law arrived with the partner's insurance papers, millions in my son's name. Later, a terrified investigator called, whispering, "Your son's fingerprints were on." Before he finished, my son walked in and asked who I was talking to. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I'm Dorothy Johnson, 65 years old, and I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I raised 3 kids, buried my husband 5 years ago after a long battle with cancer, and managed to keep my head above water through every storm that came my way. I've worked as a school librarian for 40 years. I know how to research, how to ask the right questions, and how to spot when someone's not telling the whole truth. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last Tuesday afternoon when my whole world turned upside down. Looking back now, I can see how every single moment of my life had been preparing me for what was coming. All those years in the library, teaching teenagers how to separate fact from fiction, how to trace sources back to their origins, how to build a research paper from fragments of information. All those late nights helping my own children with homework, learning patience and persistence. All those conversations with my late husband John about his work as an insurance adjuster, listening to him explain how fraud investigators followed paper trails and connected dots that others missed. I'd absorbed it all without realizing I was building a toolkit I'd desperately need one day. It was one of those crisp autumn days in Denver, the kind where the leaves are turning gold and red, and there's just enough chill in the air to make you want to stay inside with a hot cup of coffee. I was in my kitchen, the heart of my modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, making my famous apple pie, the one my grandkids beg me to bring to every family gathering, the one with the ingredient of cinnamon and just a hint of nutmeg that my own mother taught me to make when I was barely 10 years old. The kitchen radio was playing oldies, something by the Beatles, and I was humming along, my hands covered in flour, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I glanced out the window and saw Jennifer's silver Honda, my daughter-in-law. She's usually so put together, always dressed nicely, her hair perfect, her smile bright. But when she climbed out of that car, something was wrong. Very wrong. She looked pale as a ghost. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped her purse, and she clutched a manila envelope against her chest like it was a lifeline, like it contained the secrets of the universe or the key to survival itself. She didn't even knock, just walked right in through the back door like she always does, and the look on her face made my heart drop straight down to my feet. My hands stilled in the pie dough, flour dusting my forearms, and I felt a cold premonition wash over me. In that moment, before Jennifer even spoke, I knew our lives were about to change forever. You know that feeling, don't you? When your body knows something terrible is coming before your mind catches up? That's what I felt standing there in my warm kitchen with the smell of apples and cinnamon in the air, watching my daughter-in-law walk toward me like she was approaching the gallows. "Mom, Dorothy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking on every syllable. "I need to show you something. It's about Michael. It's bad." My heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. Michael is my oldest son, 38 years old, married to Jennifer for 10 years now, father to my 2 beautiful grandchildren, Emma and Tyler. He's always been the responsible one, the one who made good choices, who worked hard and stayed out of trouble. He was an honor student in high school, graduated college with honors, built a successful business from scratch. Seeing Jennifer like this, so terrified and shaken, sent every alarm bell in my head ringing at once. I remembered Michael as a boy, maybe 8 years old, coming home from school with tears streaming down his face because he'd accidentally taken home a library book without checking it out properly. He'd been so distraught about breaking the rules, even accidentally, that he'd made me drive him back to school that very evening so he could explain to the janitor what happened and leave a note of apology for the librarian. That's who my son was. Someone who couldn't sleep at night if he thought he'd done something wrong, even something small. The idea that this same person could be involved in something bad felt fundamentally impossible. We sat at my kitchen table, that old oak table that's been in my family for 3 generations. The same table where I'd helped Michael with his homework when he was a boy struggling with long division, where we'd celebrated countless birthdays with homemade cakes and candles, where we'd shared Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings. The table where my husband and I used to sit with our morning coffee, making plans for our future that would never come to pass. I wiped my hands on my apron, leaving flowery handprints on the faded fabric, and sat down across from Jennifer. My mind was already racing through possibilities. Had Michael lost his job? Was there a health crisis? Financial problems? Nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Jennifer pulled out a stack of documents from the envelope with trembling hands and spread them across the surface. The papers crisp and official-looking, covered in legal jargon and numbers that made my head spin. Insurance forms, policy numbers, beneficiary designations, all bearing official stamps and signatures. "These are life insurance policies," she said, pointing to the papers with a finger that wouldn't stop shaking. "Richard Davis's policies. $5 million total, Mom. $5 million. Richard Davis. The name hit me like a physical blow, like someone had punched me square in the chest. Richard had been Michael's business partner for 7 years, ever since they'd decided to leave their corporate jobs and strike out on their own. They'd started a consulting firm together right here in Denver, helping tech startups with their financial planning, business strategy, fundraising. The company had done well, really well. They'd built it from nothing into something that employed 15 people and had clients all over Colorado. I remembered the day Michael had introduced us to Richard, maybe 8 years ago now. They'd met at a corporate retreat, bonded over their shared frustration with bureaucratic inefficiencies and their dreams of building something meaningful. Richard had come to our house for dinner, brought flowers for me and a bottle of wine for the table. He'd been charming, intelligent, funny. He'd shown me pictures of his 2 daughters and talked about how much he loved being a father. By the end of that evening, I'd understood why Michael wanted to go into business with him. They complemented each other perfectly. Michael was the detail-oriented planner. Richard was the charismatic client-facing partner. 6 months ago, on a cold October night, Richard had died in what everyone said was a terrible accident. The story was that he'd been working late at home, gone downstairs for something, and fell. Just fell. Hit his head on the way down. By the time his wife Linda found him the next morning, he was gone. The whole community had mourned him. The funeral had been packed with hundreds of people. He'd left behind Linda and 2 teenage daughters, Sarah and Michelle, who were now facing life without their father. I remembered that funeral vividly. The church had been standing room only, filled with colleagues, clients, friends, neighbors. Linda had been practically catatonic with grief, supported on either side by family members. Those poor girls, Sarah and Michelle, barely teenagers, standing beside their mother with identical expressions of shock and incomprehension. I'd hugged Linda in the receiving line, told her how sorry I was, how Richard had been such a good man. She'd looked at me with empty eyes and nodded, unable to speak. The memory of that hollow look still haunted me. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though something deep in my gut already knew the answer wasn't going to be good. Something about this felt wrong from the start. Jennifer looked at me with tears streaming down her face, mascara running in black trails down her cheeks. "Because Michael's name is on these documents, Mom. He's listed as a beneficiary on one of them. $1 million. $1 million that was supposed to go to him if Richard died. And the police. They've started asking questions. Lots of questions." My hands went cold. Actually cold. Like all the blood had drained out of them. I looked down and saw them resting on the table. My wedding ring still on my left hand even though John had been gone 5 years now. And they looked like a stranger's hands. Pale. Trembling. Old. $1 million. That was motive. That was the kind of money that could drive someone to do terrible things. But not my Michael. Not my son who used to cry when we had to put the family dog to sleep, who volunteered at soup kitchens on Thanksgiving, who coached Little League baseball on weekends. Not the boy who'd once spent his entire month's allowance buying Girl Scout cookies from every girl in his sister's troop, because he didn't want any of them to feel bad. I thought about my husband John, gone 5 years now, but still present in so many ways. What would he have done in this moment? John had been a calm, methodical thinker, the kind of man who never panicked, who always had a plan. He'd dealt with insurance fraud cases throughout his career, had seen every kind of scam and scheme imaginable. He used to tell me stories over dinner about the creative ways people tried to cheat the system, and he always said the same thing. Follow the money, Dorothy. The money always tells the truth, even when people lie. Before I could process what she was telling me, before I could even begin to wrap my mind around the implications, my phone rang. The old landline I still keep in the kitchen, the number I've had for 30 years. I almost didn't answer it. I was too focused on the documents in front of me, too busy trying to understand what they meant. But something made me pick up. Some instinct. Some feeling that this call was important. Mrs. Johnson? A man's voice came through the line, rough and frightened, with an edge of panic that immediately put me on alert. This is Detective Raymond Foster with the Denver Police Department. I need to talk to you about your son, Michael. It's urgent. Very urgent. His fingerprints were found on... The line went dead. Not disconnected gracefully. Not the normal end of a call. Just dead. Silent. Like someone had physically cut the wire. Like someone had reached through the phone line and strangled the connection. My hand was still holding the phone, still pressed to my ear when it rang again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, could hear it rushing in my ears like ocean waves. The caller ID showed Michael's cell number. My son, calling right after that mysterious, interrupted call from the detective. The coincidence was too perfect, too precise. The detective's call cuts off mid-sentence, and exactly 30 seconds later, my son calls? That wasn't random chance. That was coordination. That was someone monitoring calls, someone with the power and resources to cut off a police detective and trigger an immediate response. My librarian's mind, trained to spot patterns and connections, was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. Mom? His voice sounded normal, maybe a little concerned, but nothing out of the ordinary. Like it was just another regular day, like we hadn't just been interrupted by a terrified detective. Everything okay? I just tried to call you, but it went to voicemail. Thought I'd try the landline. I looked at Jennifer, who was watching me with wide, terrified eyes, her face a mask of fear and confusion. Something wasn't adding up here. Something was very, very wrong. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. A detective calls about Michael's fingerprints, gets cut off mid-sentence, and immediately Michael calls asking who I'm talking to. But then I looked at Jennifer's face again, really looked at it, and I saw genuine terror there. She believed Michael was in danger, not that he was guilty. A wife knows. After 10 years of marriage, after building a life together, raising children together, she would know if her husband was capable of murder. And everything in her expression told me she knew he was innocent, but feared he was being framed. Michael, I said carefully, choosing every word like I was walking through a minefield. Where are you right now? Exactly where? At the office, Mom. At my desk. Why? You're scaring me. What's going on? Is everything okay with you? With Jennifer? I told him Jennifer was here at my house, that we needed to talk, that it was important. He said he'd be right over, would leave the office immediately. After I hung up, Jennifer grabbed my hand across the table, her grip tight enough to hurt. Mom, there's more, she whispered, glancing at the door like she expected someone to burst through it at any moment. The police came to our house this morning, around 7 a.m. 2 detectives. They asked about Richard's death. They asked if Michael had financial problems. They asked if he knew about the insurance money. They asked where he was the night Richard died. They looked at me like they already thought he was guilty. My mind was racing, thoughts spinning like a tornado. I'd known from the beginning that Richard's death had seemed off, had seemed strange. He was only 42 years old, healthy, athletic. He ran marathons for charity. He didn't drink heavily. He was careful. A fall down the stairs? It had seemed unlikely from the start, but grief has a way of making you accept things you might otherwise question. We tell ourselves it was just a tragic accident because the alternative is too horrible to consider. I stood up from the table, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, The autumn day continued obliviously. Neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, cars passing by on their way to ordinary destinations. Life going on as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. How many times had I stood at this exact window, washing dishes or watching for John to come home from work, thinking about nothing more important than what to make for dinner? How many ordinary moments had I taken for granted, never imagining that one day I'd be standing here processing the possibility that my son was being framed for murder? "Tell me everything," I said to Jennifer, pulling my hands away from the pie dough and wiping them on my apron. "From the very beginning. Don't leave anything out. Every detail might matter." She took a shaky breath and told me that 3 weeks ago, completely out of the blue, she'd received a phone call from an insurance company. They said they were calling to verify some information about a policy, asked her to confirm Michael's social security number, their address, his date of birth. She'd thought it was just routine administrative stuff, maybe something related to Michael's work, until they casually mentioned Richard's name. That's when alarm bells started ringing in her head. "What exactly did they say?" I asked, my research instincts kicking in. Details mattered. Precise wording mattered. The woman on the phone said, "We're calling to verify beneficiary information for the Richard Davis life insurance policy claim." I said I didn't know anything about it, and she got flustered. Said she must have called the wrong number. But Mom, she'd asked for me by name. She knew exactly who she was calling. That's when Jennifer started digging, started going through files in Michael's home office. She'd found these documents hidden in a file marked business records, buried under stacks of tax returns and quarterly reports. Hidden, not filed properly, not where they should be. She described going through that office systematically, spending an entire afternoon while Michael was at work and the kids were at school. She'd started with the obvious places, the filing cabinets, the desk drawers, finding nothing unusual. Then she'd moved to the closet, pulling out boxes of old documents, and that's where she'd found the manila envelope, hidden, deliberately concealed under other papers. Her hands had been shaking so badly she'd almost dropped it. "Did you ask Michael about them?" I asked, already knowing the answer. I tried yesterday afternoon when he got home from work. He got defensive immediately, said it was complicated business stuff I wouldn't understand, that it was standard practice for partners to have policies on each other. But Mom, Michael tells me everything. We don't keep secrets. In 10 years of marriage, we've never hidden things from each other. This isn't like him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He changed the subject. He practically ran out of the room. I thought about my own marriage to John, 35 years before cancer took him from me. We'd had our share of difficult conversations, financial worries, health scares, family dramas, but we'd always faced them together, always sat down at this very table and talked things through until we found a solution or at least a path forward. The idea of John hiding something important from me, refusing to meet my eyes, running from a difficult conversation, that would have been completely out of character, just as it was out of character for Michael, which meant either Michael was guilty and acting completely unlike himself, or he was innocent and terrified about something he didn't know how to explain. As a mother, as someone who'd known this boy since before he was born, who'd felt him kick inside me and held him moments after he entered the world, I knew which explanation made sense. When Michael arrived at my house about 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 6 months. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, making him look hollow and haunted. His usually carefully pressed shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened and crooked. He'd lost weight, I realized. His face was thinner, his cheekbones more prominent. He sat down heavily at the table like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, and he looked at the insurance documents spread across the oak surface with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fear? Resignation? Guilt? But more than that, I saw exhaustion. Bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. This was a man who hadn't slept properly in months, who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. I recognized that look because I'd seen it in the mirror during John's illness, during those endless months of treatments and hospital visits and false hopes. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "From your office," Jennifer said, her voice stronger now, angry. "Michael, what's going on? Why is your name on Richard's life insurance? Why is there a $1 million policy with you as the beneficiary?" My son looked at me, and for the first time in his adult life, I saw real, genuine fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a child afraid of punishment, but the fear of a man who knows his life is falling apart and there's nothing he can do to stop it. "Mom, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, I don't know why this happened. Richard set up these policies about 8 months before he died. He said it was standard practice for business partners, just in case something happened to one of us. He said his policy named me, and mine named him. I didn't think anything of it. It seemed like good planning, like the responsible thing to do. I trusted him. The way he said those last 3 words, I trusted him, broke my heart. There was such betrayal in his voice, such hurt. Whatever was happening here, Michael felt like Richard had set him up, had used their friendship and professional partnership against him. But why? Why would Richard do that to someone he considered a friend? "But $5 million total, Michael?" I said, keeping my voice level even though my insides were churning. "And $1 million for you specifically? That's not standard practice. That's unusual. That's the kind of thing that makes police suspicious." "I know how it looks," he said, his voice cracking, tears forming in his eyes. "I know exactly how it looks. Like I had motive. Like I wanted him dead. But Mom, I swear to you I didn't kill Richard. I would never hurt anyone, let alone my best friend, my partner. You raised me better than that. You have to believe me." I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling how cold it was, how much he was trembling. "I do believe you," I said firmly. "I believe you with every fiber of my being. But belief isn't enough. We need evidence. We need to prove your innocence. And to do that, we need to understand what really happened." I wanted to believe him more than anything in the world. Every instinct as a mother, every fiber of my being, told me to trust my son, to believe in his innocence. But that phone call from Detective Foster kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. "Your son's fingerprints were on..." On what? What had Michael's fingerprints been found on? And why had the detective sounded so terrified, so urgent? Why had the call been cut off so abruptly? That's when I made a decision, right there at my kitchen table. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for the police to arrest my son for something he didn't do. I wasn't going to watch my family be destroyed by false accusations and circumstantial evidence. I was going to find out the truth myself, no matter what it took, no matter where it led. I thought about all those years in the library, all those research skills I'd developed. I thought about John's stories about insurance fraud investigation. I thought about the fact that I was 65 years old, retired with time and motivation and nothing to lose. I thought about my grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, who deserved to grow up with their father in their lives. And I thought about the fact that sometimes, the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who give you the greatest advantage. "Tell me everything about the night Richard died," I said, pulling out a notepad. The same kind I used to use at the library to help patrons with research. Every single detail you remember, no matter how small or insignificant it seems. Michael took a deep breath, closed his eyes like he was traveling back in time. It was 6 months ago, October 15th, a Tuesday night. I remember because Jennifer was at her book club, and I was planning to just have a quiet evening at home, maybe watch the game. Richard called me around 8 p.m. on my cell, said he needed to talk about something important. "Business stuff," he said, but his voice sounded strange, stressed, not like him at all. "Strange how?" I asked, writing everything down in the shorthand I'd developed over years of taking reference notes. "Paranoid, maybe. Worried?" He asked me to come to his house, said he didn't want to talk on the phone. I thought maybe there was a problem with one of our clients, or maybe he'd gotten a big offer for the company and wanted to discuss it. So I drove over there, got to his house around 9 p.m. Linda and the girls were out at a school event, some concert or play, so it was just Richard and me. "And?" Jennifer prompted when he paused, her hand finding his across the table. He was acting weird from the moment I walked in. Kept checking the windows, looking over his shoulder like he thought someone was watching. The curtains were all drawn, which was unusual. He poured us both a drink, whiskey, but then he barely touched his. He said he'd found some irregularities in our company accounts. Money that didn't add up, transactions that didn't make sense. He thought someone might be embezzling from us, stealing from the company we'd built together. My pen stopped moving. Embezzling? How much money are we talking about? He didn't say exactly. Said he'd only just noticed it, that he needed more time to investigate, to figure out how much was missing and where it was going. He wanted to wait until he had solid proof before involving me officially, before we went to the police or brought in auditors. He said he had suspicions about who it might be, but he wasn't ready to accuse anyone yet. I leaned forward, my research instincts fully activated now. Did he show you any evidence? Any documents? Bank statements? Anything concrete? Michael shook his head. He had papers spread out on his desk in his home office, but he didn't let me see them clearly. He said he wanted to be absolutely certain before showing me the details. He was worried about making a false accusation, about damaging someone's reputation if he was wrong. Did he give you any hints? I asked. Any names? Anything at all? Michael shook his head miserably. No. He said he'd tell me everything once he was sure. He made me promise not to worry, said he'd handle it. We talked for maybe an hour, mostly about business stuff, quarterly projections, client contracts. Then I left around 10 p.m. That was the last time I saw him alive. The next morning, Linda came home from her sister's house where she'd stayed overnight with the girls, and she found him at the bottom of the stairs. The police said he must have tripped, hit his head on the way down. Case closed. Accident. But it wasn't an accident. I knew that now with absolute certainty. Richard had discovered embezzlement. Someone was stealing from the company. And less than 12 hours after telling Michael about it, Richard was dead. That wasn't coincidence. That was murder. Did you tell the police about this conversation? I asked. About the embezzlement? Michael looked ashamed, avoiding my eyes. No. I should have, but I didn't. I was in shock, grieving, and part of me thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe Richard had been stressed about something else. I didn't want to make accusations without proof. I didn't want to tarnish his memory or upset Linda and the girls any more than they already were. And honestly, Mom, I was scared. If someone had killed Richard to cover up embezzlement, what would stop them from coming after me, too? There it was. The real reason Michael had been acting strange, had hidden these documents, had gotten defensive with Jennifer. Not guilt, but fear. He was terrified that whoever had killed Richard might target him next, might hurt his family. He'd been trying to protect them by keeping quiet, by pretending everything was normal. It was a stupid, misguided decision, but I understood it. Fear makes us do irrational things. After Michael and Jennifer left my house an hour later, promising to be careful and to keep me updated, I sat alone in my kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee, thinking harder than I'd thought in years. The abandoned pie dough sat on the counter, forgotten, drying out. I'd finish it later, or maybe I wouldn't. Pie making seemed trivial now, almost absurd compared to what we were facing. I needed help, but I didn't know who to trust. The police had Michael's fingerprints on something connected to Richard's death, probably the murder weapon, based on how the detective's call had been cut off. There was an insurance policy giving Michael a clear financial motive, and someone had the power to silence a police detective mid-phone call. This was bigger than just a murder. This was a conspiracy. The evening light was fading from the kitchen, casting long shadows across the walls. I turned on the overhead light and got to work. If I was going to save my son, I needed to become an investigator. I needed to gather evidence, follow leads, and build a case that would prove his innocence beyond any doubt. I pulled out my laptop. My grandson Tyler had taught me how to use it a few years ago, and I'd gotten pretty good at internet research during my years as a librarian. And I started digging into Richard Davis's death. The local Denver newspaper had covered it briefly in their Metro section. Local businessman dies in tragic home accident. There was a photo of Richard from some charity event, smiling in a tuxedo. Another photo showed his wife Linda and their 2 daughters at the funeral, all 3 of them destroyed by grief. I read every article I could find, making notes, looking for inconsistencies. The police report, what little was public, said Richard had been found at approximately 8 a.m. by his wife, who had returned home from spending the night at her sister's house. The medical examiner estimated time of death between midnight and 3 a.m. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall downstairs. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. Case closed as accidental death. But if Richard had been alive when Michael left at 10 p.m. and died sometime after midnight, that meant he'd been alone in the house for at least 2 hours. Plenty of time for someone else to arrive. Someone he would have let in willingly. Someone he trusted. I created a timeline in my notebook, mapping out every known fact. The methodical process of writing it all down helped me think more clearly. This was something I'd learned during my decades as a librarian. When faced with overwhelming information, you break it down, you organize it, you create structure from chaos. I drew lines connecting events, circled suspicious timing, marked questions that needed answers. The notebook page became a visual representation of a murder investigation, though I could hardly believe that's what I was doing. Me, Dorothy Johnson, investigating a murder. It would have seemed absurd a week ago. Now it felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. 8 Kiaos p.m. Richard calls Michael. Sounds paranoid. 9 p.m. Michael arrives at Richard's house 10 p.m. Michael leaves Richard alive. Midnight, 3 a.m. Richard dies 8 a.m. Linda finds Richard's body 2 to 5 hours between Michael leaving and Richard dying. That was the window when the real killer had struck. I needed to find out who else Richard had contact with during that time. Phone records, security cameras, neighbors who might have seen something. The police had already conducted an investigation, but they'd concluded it was an accident. They hadn't been looking for a killer. I searched for Detective Raymond Foster, found his name in the Denver Police Department directory online. His official photo showed a man in his 40s, serious expression, detective's badge clearly visible. His office phone number was listed, along with his email address. But when I called the main police number and asked to speak with him, the receptionist told me Detective Foster had called in sick that morning and wasn't expected back for several days. Sick or silenced? My mind immediately went to the worst possibility. What if whoever had cut off our phone call had gotten to Detective Foster? What if he was in danger because he'd tried to warn me? I hung up the phone, my hands shaking slightly. This was real. This was dangerous. Someone out there was powerful enough to kill a man, frame an innocent person, and silence police investigations. And I was a 65-year-old retired librarian who lived alone in a suburban house with locks that probably wouldn't stop a determined intruder. For a moment, I considered dropping this, letting the lawyers handle it, staying safe. But then I thought about Michael's face, about the fear and desperation in his eyes. I thought about my grandchildren growing up without their father. I thought about Jennifer trying to raise 2 kids alone while her husband sat in prison for a crime he didn't commit. No, I wouldn't let that happen. I couldn't. I knew then what I had to do. I had to find out who really killed Richard Davis. And I had to do it before my son ended up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Time was running out. That evening, just as the sun was setting and painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and purple, I drove to Richard's old house. Linda had moved out 2 months after his death. Too many painful memories, people said, and taken the girls to live with her sister in Colorado Springs. The house had been on the market ever since, standing empty and alone. The for sale sign swayed in the cold November wind as I pulled my car up to the curb, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there for a long moment, looking at the house where Richard Davis had died. It was a nice house, upscale but not ostentatious, the kind of place that spoke of success without being flashy. 2 stories, brick facade, mature trees in the front yard. The lawn had grown a bit long, and there were leaves piled against the front porch. The whole place had that abandoned feel, that sadness that clings to houses where tragedy has struck. I'm not proud of what I did next, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and I was more desperate than I'd ever been in my entire life. I'd noticed during the funeral reception, when people had gathered at the house to pay their respects, that Linda kept a spare key under a fake rock near the front porch. It was a common hiding spot, Not very original. Sure enough, when I checked, the key was still there, cold and metal in my palm. I let myself in, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. The house was empty, all the furniture covered with white sheets like ghosts. It felt abandoned, haunted, full of memories and sadness. Dust motes floated in the dying light that filtered through the gaps in the curtains. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. The air inside was stale, musty, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stood in the entryway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, and I felt the weight of what had happened here. A man had died in this house. A husband, a father, a friend. And I was convinced now that he'd been murdered, that his death was far from the accident everyone believed it to be. I made my way to the staircase where Richard had supposedly fallen. It was a straight staircase, about 15 steps, with a sturdy wooden railing. Not particularly steep. Not the kind of staircase that seemed inherently dangerous. I examined every step, every inch of that railing, looking for anything that might tell me what really happened that night 6 months ago. That's when I found it. On the 5th step from the bottom, there was a small gouge in the wood, maybe half an inch long, like something heavy and metal had struck it with force. And on the railing, when I looked close enough, running my fingers along the smooth wood, there were scratch marks that didn't match the grain of the wood. They were fresh, or relatively fresh, deep, deliberate. Someone had tampered with this staircase. Someone had either rigged something to make Richard fall, or someone had staged the scene after killing him elsewhere. This was evidence. Real, physical evidence that Richard's death wasn't an accident. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and took photos from every angle. Close-ups of the gouge, wide shots showing the context, pictures of the scratch marks on the railing. My hands were shaking so badly that some of the photos came out blurry, and I had to take them again. I documented everything methodically, using the same careful attention to detail I'd used when helping students cite research sources. I was so focused on documenting everything that I almost didn't hear the car pulling into the driveway. My blood ran cold. I ducked behind a covered sofa in the living room, my heart threatening to break through my ribcage, holding my breath like my life depended on it. Through the sheer curtains on the window, I saw a black Mercedes pull up. Expensive. New. The kind of car that cost more than I made in 2 years. A man got out. Tall, probably 6'2", wearing a dark suit that looked custom-tailored, expensive shoes that gleamed even in the fading light. He was maybe 45, with dark hair graying at the temples, a strong jaw, cold eyes. He looked around carefully, methodically, scanning the street and the neighboring houses before approaching the front door. He moved like someone who was used to being in control, used to getting what he wanted. He used a key to let himself in. My hiding spot was only about 15 feet from the door. I pressed myself against the wall behind the sheet-covered sofa, making myself as small as possible, praying he wouldn't come into the living room, praying he wouldn't hear my terrified breathing. The man walked through the house like he owned it, his footsteps confident and measured. He checked rooms, opened closets, ran his hand along surfaces. When he got close to where I was hiding, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne, I could hear him talking on his phone, his voice low and controlled. "Yeah, I'm here at the property," he said. "No sign of anyone poking around. The evidence is secure. Once we close the sale next week, we'll demolish the staircase during renovations and no one will ever know what really happened here. Richard's death will stay an accident, and we can all move on. Demolish the evidence. Secure the crime scene. This wasn't just a murder cover-up. This was a conspiracy, carefully planned and executed. And this man, whoever he was part of it. Possibly the murderer himself, or at least an accomplice. I wanted to look at him more closely, to see his face clearly so I could identify him later. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare risk making a sound. I stayed frozen behind that sofa, my muscles screaming from being held so still, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he must hear it. "No, the widow hasn't been back here," he continued. "She doesn't know anything. As far as she's concerned, her husband had an accident. The business partner might be a problem, but we've got that handled. The frame is solid. If he starts asking too many questions, we'll just accelerate the timeline on his arrest. The business partner, Michael. They were talking about my son. These people, whoever they were, had planned this from the beginning. They'd killed Richard and set up Michael to take the fall if anyone questioned the accident story. This was premeditated, calculated, evil. The man spent maybe 10 more minutes in the house, and every second felt like an hour to me. I barely dared to breathe. Finally, mercifully, he left. I heard his car start, heard him drive away. I waited another 20 minutes before I dared to move, my legs cramped from crouching, my heart still racing. When I finally stood up, my knees almost gave out. I had to lean against the sofa for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm myself. I'd just hidden from a murderer, or at least from someone involved in a murder conspiracy. If he'd found me, I might have ended up like Richard. Another tragic accident. Another case closed. When I finally got back to my car, I was shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. But I'd found something crucial. Something that proved Richard's death wasn't an accident. Now I just had to figure out who that man was, and what role he played in all of this. I drove home slowly, checking my rearview mirror constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed. Every set of headlights behind me made my pulse spike. Every dark car made me wonder if it was the black Mercedes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted from the adrenaline crash. Back home, I called Jennifer on her cell phone. "I need you to do something for me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Go through Michael's business files again. Look for anything about company finances, especially from the 8 months before Richard died. Bank statements, wire transfers, vendor payments, anything. I think Richard found something, and I think that's why he was killed." "Mom, are you saying someone murdered Richard?" Her voice was small, frightened. "Yes," I said with absolute certainty. "And I'm going to prove it. I'm going to save Michael. But I need your help." Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. I lived on coffee and determination. Jennifer sent me scanned copies of dozens of documents from Michael's files. He'd given her permission to share everything once I explained what I was doing. I spread them across my dining room table, stacks of financial statements and account ledgers, transaction records and bank statements. I felt like I was back in the library helping students with research projects. Except this time, the stakes were my son's freedom and possibly his life. I wasn't an accountant, had never taken a business class in my life. But I wasn't stupid either, and 65 years of life had taught me how to spot patterns, how to see when numbers didn't add up, how to follow a trail even when someone was trying to cover it up. The first day, I just tried to understand what I was looking at. I made lists of all the vendors and contractors the company paid regularly. I noted unusual expenses, large payments, anything that seemed out of the ordinary. My dining room table disappeared under layers of paper, covered with my notes and highlights and sticky tabs marking important pages. The second day, I started cross-referencing everything. I looked up vendor names in the Colorado Business Registration Database, a trick I'd learned helping library patrons research legitimate companies. I checked addresses using Google Maps Street View. I searched for phone numbers and websites, and slowly, a pattern emerged. And what I found made my blood run cold. Starting about 8 months before Richard's death, money had been disappearing from the company accounts. Small amounts at first, $2,000 here, $5,000 there, the kind of amounts that might go unnoticed in a busy business with multiple clients and ongoing expenses. But it added up. Over those 8 months, nearly $500,000 had been siphoned off into accounts I couldn't trace. The transactions were cleverly hidden, disguised as routine business expenses, payments to vendors and contractors, professional services, consulting fees, software licenses, all perfectly normal-looking on the surface. But when I started cross-referencing the vendor names with state business registrations, something my librarian research skills came in handy for, I found that half of them didn't exist. They were shell companies, fake businesses. Someone was embezzling from Michael and Richard's firm, systematically stealing $500,000, and Richard had figured it out. That's what he'd wanted to tell Michael the night he died. I made a comprehensive list of the fake vendors. Rocky Mountain Consulting LLC, $45,000 in payments, no business registration found. Summit Tech Services, $38,000. Registered address is a UPS store. Peak Performance Solutions, $52,000. No website, no phone listing. Aspen Business Group, $67,000. Business registration showed it was only created a month before first payment. Colorado Strategic Advisors, $41,000. Registered to a vacant lot in downtown Denver, and on and on. 13 different fake companies in total, all receiving payments from Michael and Richard's firm. All carefully designed to look legitimate on the surface. All part of an elaborate embezzlement scheme. The third day, exhausted and running on nothing but coffee and determination, I tried to find connections between the shell companies. They'd all been registered through different agents, at different addresses, with different stated purposes. But when I dug deeper into the public records, using research techniques I'd refined over 40 years in libraries, I found something interesting. 7 of the 13 companies had been registered within a 3-day period. That seemed like more than coincidence. And when I traced the registration agent information, I found they'd all used the same law firm to file their paperwork. Davis and Associates Legal Services. Davis. That name sent chills down my spine. Was this Thomas Davis's firm? I searched for more information and found that yes, Thomas Davis, Richard's older brother, owned a law firm that specialized in business formation and real estate law. The same Thomas Davis I'd seen at the funeral, the grieving brother who'd given such a moving eulogy. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was ugly. That's when my doorbell rang. It was almost midnight, way past the time when anyone would normally visit. I looked through the peephole with my heart in my throat and saw a man I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, maybe early 40s, wearing casual clothes, jeans and a jacket, not the expensive suit of the man I'd seen at Richard's house. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder at the dark street behind him, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly when I cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock in place. "I'm Detective Raymond Foster. We spoke on the phone earlier this week. Please, I need to talk to you. It's not safe for either of us, but you need to know the truth." I hesitated for a long moment. This could be a trap. This could be the person who'd cut off our phone call, coming to silence me like they'd probably silenced others. But something in his eyes, something desperate and honest, made me take the risk. I let him in, immediately regretting it, but knowing I had no choice. He sat at my kitchen table, that same table where this whole nightmare had started, and he looked haunted, like a man who hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, hands that trembled slightly, jaw tight with tension. "I'm sorry I had to hang up on you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I didn't have a choice. They were listening to the call. They monitor my phone, my computer, everything. They know I've been looking into Richard Davis's death. They know I have doubts about the official story." "Who's they?" I demanded, keeping my voice down even though we were alone in my house. "Thomas Davis," he said, and the name hit me like a physical blow. Richard's older brother. He's behind everything. The embezzlement, Richard's murder, the frame job on your son. And he has people everywhere. Police department, city hall, the courts. I tried to investigate properly, tried to follow the evidence, but they shut me down at every turn. They threatened my family, Mrs. Johnson. They have photos of me that could destroy my marriage, end my career. I'm trapped. Thomas Davis. I remembered him vaguely from Richard's funeral. Tall, imposing, well-dressed, giving a tearful eulogy about his beloved little brother, about how Richard had always looked up to him, how they'd been best friends since childhood. I'd thought he was genuinely grieving. I'd felt sorry for him, this man who'd lost his brother so tragically and unexpectedly. But if what Detective Foster was saying was true, those tears had been an act, a performance. Thomas Davis had killed his own brother and was now trying to frame an innocent man to cover it up. "Tell me everything," I said, pulling out my notepad. "Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Detective Foster took a deep breath and told me a story that made me sick to my stomach. Thomas Davis was a successful businessman, owner of a real estate development company that had made millions over the years. But about a year ago, his company had started having problems. Projects were failing, investors were pulling out, there were rumors of bad deals and worse management. Thomas needed money desperately to save his business, to maintain his lifestyle, to avoid bankruptcy and public humiliation. His company was leveraged to the hilt, Foster explained. He'd taken out loans against every property, every asset. He'd made some bad investments in commercial real estate just before the market softened. He was hemorrhaging money, and his investors were getting nervous. If word got out about how bad his financial situation was, the whole house of cards would collapse. So he'd started embezzling from his brother's company. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. He'd used his business connections to set up shell companies, to forge documents, to make the thefts look like legitimate business expenses. He thought he'd never get caught, but Richard was meticulous about the books, always double-checking the numbers, and he'd eventually noticed the discrepancies. Richard confronted Thomas about 2 weeks before he died, Foster said. We found text messages on Richard's phone that mentioned a meeting between them. Richard was planning to go to the police, to press charges, to make sure Thomas went to prison for what he'd done. He couldn't let his brother destroy the business he'd built, couldn't let him steal from the employees who depended on them. So, Thomas killed him, I said, the pieces finally falling into place. Murdered him in cold blood, Foster confirmed, made it look like an accident. And then he set up your son to take the fall just in case anyone ever questioned the accident story. He planted evidence, your son's fingerprints on the weapon used to kill Richard before the staged fall down the stairs. He manipulated the insurance policies. He created a perfect frame job. What weapon? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. A glass paperweight from your son's office. Heavy, distinctive. Thomas or one of his people stole it from Michael's desk months before the murder. They used it to strike Richard, then placed it briefly at the scene to transfer fingerprints before removing it. I saw the preliminary forensic report before it was buried, before my captain ordered me to stop investigating. Your son's prints were on that paperweight, and Richard's blood was on it too. That's the evidence they're planning to use to arrest Michael. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. But Michael gave you that information about the embezzlement conversation. Doesn't that help prove he's innocent? Foster shook his head sadly. They're spinning it the other way, saying Michael found out Richard had discovered his embezzlement. They're claiming Michael was the one stealing from the company, not Thomas. They say Michael killed Richard to cover it up and claim the insurance money. It's a perfect frame. Everything points to your son. We have to fight this, I said, steel in my voice. We have to prove Thomas did it. How? Foster asked helplessly. He owns half the police force. The investigation is already closed. The case is airtight. I can't even trust my own partner. The evidence against Michael is overwhelming. Then we get new evidence, I said. Evidence so strong they can't ignore it. Evidence that proves Thomas Davis is a murderer. Over the next week, I barely left my house except to follow leads. I put together a plan. It was risky, maybe even dangerous. But it was the only way to save my son and bring Richard's real killer to justice. First, I hired a lawyer. Sarah Mitchell came highly recommended by a friend from my book club, Margaret Williams, who'd gone through a nasty divorce and swore by Sarah's tenacity and intelligence. Margaret had told me, Sarah doesn't give up. Ever. If anyone can help you, she can. When I called her office and explained my situation, gave her the broad strokes without revealing too much over the phone, she agreed to meet with me the next day. Her office was in downtown Denver, on the 15th floor of a sleek, modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The reception area was tastefully decorated, professional but not pretentious. Her assistant, a young woman named Katie, offered me coffee while I waited, which I accepted gratefully. When Sarah Mitchell came out to greet me, she was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and a firm handshake that told me she meant business. She wore a tailored suit that spoke of success, and she moved with the confidence of someone who'd won more battles than she'd lost. We sat in her office, A corner room with those stunning views of Denver and the mountains beyond. Under different circumstances, I would have appreciated the vista. Today I could barely see it. When I showed her everything I'd found, the financial records showing embezzlement, the photos from Richard's staircase, Detective Foster's testimony about corruption and evidence tampering, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Johnson," she said slowly, examining the documents spread across her desk. "If even half of this is true, we're dealing with a major criminal conspiracy. But we need more evidence. We need Thomas Davis on record admitting to something. We need proof that will hold up in court, not just circumstantial evidence and a cop's testimony that could be dismissed as sour grapes." "I have an idea about that," I said, and I explained my plan. The life insurance policy was the key to everything. Thomas had set it up so that if Michael was convicted of Richard's murder, the policy would be voided, and the money would revert to the company, which Thomas now controlled as Richard's heir and business successor. But if Michael was never charged, or if he was charged and acquitted, the money would still go to him as the designated beneficiary. Thomas needed Michael convicted, needed him to take the fall, which meant Thomas was probably still working on building the case, still gathering evidence, still orchestrating the frame job. And that gave us an opportunity. Sarah understood immediately. "You want to approach him. Make him think you know something. See if you can get him to reveal himself." "Exactly," I said. "If I can get him talking, if I can make him think I'm just a confused old woman who found some documents she doesn't understand, he might slip up. He might say something incriminating." "It's dangerous," Sarah warned. "If he suspects you're trying to trap him, he might see you as a threat. And we know what he does to people he considers threats." "I know the risk," I said. "But what choice do I have? If I don't do this, my son goes to prison for murder. I can't let that happen." Sarah studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but we do this right. We wire you for sound. We coordinate with federal authorities. I know an FBI agent who specializes in white-collar crime and corruption. We make sure you're protected, and that any evidence we gather will be admissible in court." 3 days later, I called Thomas Davis at his office. Introduced myself as Michael's mother, said I'd been going through some of Richard's old business files that Michael had kept, said I'd found some documents I thought Thomas should have since he'd taken over the company. He agreed to meet me immediately. Too quickly, too eagerly. The desperation in his voice confirmed what I'd suspected. He was worried about what I might have found. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Denver, a trendy place with exposed brick walls and expensive lattes. The kind of place where professional people had business meetings, where no one would look twice at a well-dressed man meeting an older woman for coffee. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if Thomas saw through my act? What if he realized I was wearing a wire? What if he simply denied everything and walked away, then moved up his timeline for framing Michael? I thought about John, wished desperately that he was here to tell me I was doing the right thing. I thought about calling the whole thing off, letting Sarah and the FBI handle it through official channels. But I knew in my gut that wasn't enough. Thomas had too much power, too many connections. We needed him to confess, to reveal himself, and he was more likely to do that with a seemingly harmless elderly woman than with law enforcement. The morning of the meeting, Sarah Mitchell had arranged for me to wear a wire, a tiny device hidden under my blouse, so small you'd never notice it. She'd also contacted a friendly FBI agent named Robert Hayes, who was very interested in the embezzlement angle. Financial fraud was federal, which meant it was outside the reach of whatever local police officers Thomas had bought off. Agent Hayes came to Sarah's office to brief me. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with a serious demeanor but kind eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to be clear about the risks here," he said. "Thomas Davis is dangerous. We have reason to believe he's killed once, and he won't hesitate to do it again if he feels threatened. We'll have agents nearby, but if things go wrong, there may be a delay before we can intervene." "I understand," I said, though my hands were shaking slightly. "I'm not asking you to eliminate the risk. I'm asking you to catch a murderer." He nodded, respect showing in his eyes. We'll be monitoring the audio feed in real time. If at any point you feel unsafe, just say the phrase we discussed, and we'll move in immediately. The safe phrase was, "I need to call my daughter." Simple, natural, something I might say in conversation that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Agent Hayes had me practice saying it several times, making sure it sounded natural, making sure I could deliver it calmly even under stress. We ran through various scenarios. What if Thomas got aggressive? What if he tried to leave? What if he realized I was recording? Each time I practiced staying calm, staying in character. It felt surreal, like I was an actor preparing for a role. Except this wasn't a play. This was my son's life on the line. One mistake, one slip in my performance, and Thomas might walk away free while Michael went to prison. Thomas arrived at the coffee shop right on time, looking every bit the successful businessman in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He was handsome in a cold sort of way, with the same facial features as Richard, but none of the warmth. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, sitting down across from me with a practiced expression of sympathy and concern. "How are you holding up? This must be so hard for you with everything that's happened. Michael is lucky to have such a devoted mother." I wanted to throw my coffee in his face. Instead, I smiled and played the part of the confused, worried elderly woman. "I just want to understand what happened to Richard. Michael says Richard was his best friend. It's all so tragic." "It is," Thomas agreed, ordering an espresso from the passing barista. "Richard's death was devastating for all of us. I miss my brother every day." Liar, I thought, but I kept my expression neutral, channeling every bit of acting ability I possessed. "I found these documents in Michael's files," I said, sliding the folder across the table. Inside were copies of the embezzlement records I'd discovered. I don't really understand business stuff, but Michael seemed to think they were important. "What are they?" Thomas opened the folder, and I watched his face go pale. Actually pale, the color draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His hands tightened on the papers. "Where did you get these?" His voice was sharp now, controlled but with an edge of barely suppressed panic. "From Michael's office, like I said. He had them in a file with Richard's name on it." "Are they important?" "They look like some kind of financial records, but I can't make sense of all the numbers." Thomas stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out how much I really knew. "These are just accounting errors," he finally said, forcing his voice back to calm. "Nothing to worry about. Just some confusion in our bookkeeping from last year." $500,000 in errors? I pressed, letting just a hint of doubt show in my voice. "Come on, Thomas. Richard told Michael someone was stealing from the company. That's what they talked about the night Richard died. And now Richard's dead and you've taken over his business, and you're telling me this is nothing?" His expression hardened. Any pretense of sympathy vanished. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Johnson. You should stop asking questions and let the authorities do their job." "You mean the authorities you've bought?" I said quietly. "The ones who are going to arrest my son for something he didn't do?" Thomas leaned forward, and for the first time I saw the real man behind the mask. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "Your son is going to prison, Mrs. Johnson. The evidence is already in place. There's nothing you can do about it. His fingerprints are on the murder weapon. He had motive. He had opportunity. The case is airtight." "What evidence?" I asked innocently. "The police said Richard's death was an accident. There is no murder case." He realized his mistake immediately. His eyes widened just a fraction. He'd just admitted knowledge of a murder when the official story was accident. "What I meant was," he started, but I cut him off. "You meant that you killed your brother because he found out you were stealing from his company. You murdered Richard, and then you set up my son to take the fall. You planted Michael's fingerprints on the weapon. You manipulated the insurance policies. You've bought off police and judges. But you made one mistake, Thomas." "What's that?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, like I was a foolish old woman who couldn't possibly be a threat. "You underestimated me," I said. That's when Michael stepped out from where he'd been sitting at a nearby table, his own recording device clearly visible in his hand, and behind him, 2 FBI agents in dark suits with badges displayed. The look on Thomas Davis's face, shock, fury, disbelief, was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and I saw pure rage there, hatred so intense it was almost physical. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a man already planning his legal defense. They arrested him right there in that coffee shop, right in front of dozens of witnesses. The charges were extensive: embezzlement, murder, conspiracy, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. Sarah Mitchell had already filed motions to examine all the evidence in Richard's death, and with the FBI involved, the local police couldn't bury it anymore. As they led Thomas away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, a promise and a threat. But I didn't regret it. I've never regretted it for a single moment. Detective Foster came forward with his full testimony the next day, offering to testify against Thomas in exchange for federal protection for his family. He revealed everything: the corruption in the police department, the pressure he'd faced to close the case, the evidence that had been suppressed or destroyed. He told us about meetings he'd been forced to attend, where his captain and other senior officers had made it clear that the Richard Davis case was closed and any further investigation would be career suicide. He described the photos they'd shown him, photos of him having coffee with a female colleague, taken from angles and with timing that made it look like something more. The implicit was clear: drop the investigation, or these photos would destroy his marriage and his reputation. "I have a wife and 2 kids," Foster said during his formal statement to the FBI. "I tried to tell myself that one case wasn't worth losing everything, but I couldn't sleep at night, couldn't look at myself in the mirror. When Mrs. Johnson called, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let an innocent man go to prison while I stayed silent." The forensic evidence from Richard's staircase was re-examined by FBI experts. They confirmed what I'd suspected: the fall had been staged after death. Richard had been struck with the paperweight first, then positioned on the stairs to make it look like an accident. The FBI forensic pathologist explained it in terms I could understand. The blood spatter pattern was wrong for a fall. When someone falls and hits their head, blood sprays in one direction from the point of impact. But Richard's blood was found in multiple locations on the stairs, suggesting he was moved after the fatal blow. Additionally, the angle and force of the head wound wasn't consistent with striking a stair during a fall. Someone hit him with significant force while he was standing. Thomas's financial records were subpoenaed. They found the shell companies, traced the embezzled funds, discovered that he'd been days away from bankruptcy when he'd started stealing from his brother. They found the evidence of the frame job, records showing Thomas had hired someone to steal the paperweight from Michael's office, communications with corrupt police officers, payments to witnesses who were prepared to testify falsely against my son. The investigation expanded beyond what any of us had imagined. The FBI discovered that Thomas had been running a larger criminal enterprise, using his law firm and real estate company to launder money for various clients. The embezzlement from his brother's company was just the tip of the iceberg. They found evidence of fraud, money laundering, witness intimidation, and connections to organized crime figures. 6 police officers were arrested on corruption charges, including the captain who'd pressured Detective Foster to close the case. 2 judges were implicated in the scandal, accused of accepting bribes to influence rulings in Thomas's favor. A city councilman who'd helped expedite permits for Thomas's real estate projects was indicted for accepting kickbacks. The scandal rocked Denver. It was front-page news for weeks, the kind of story that dominated local television coverage and spawned countless investigative reports. How Dorothy Johnson, retired librarian, brought down a criminal empire, read one headline. I refused most interview requests, wanting privacy for my family, but the story took on a life of its own. The trial took 4 months, and I sat in that courtroom every single day. I watched as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the evidence. I watched Thomas's expensive lawyers try and fail to poke holes in the case. I listened to Detective Foster's testimony about corruption and cover-ups. I heard Linda Davis break down on the witness stand as she testified about how much her husband had trusted his brother, how Richard would have done anything to help Thomas if he'd just asked instead of stealing. Linda's testimony was particularly powerful. She described her husband's increasing stress in the weeks before his death, how he'd been working late nights going through financial records, how he'd told her he'd discovered something troubling about the business, but wouldn't give details until he was certain. She described the last time she saw him alive, kissing him goodbye as she left for her sister's house with the girls, how he'd seemed worried, but had assured her everything would be fine. Richard always tried to see the best in people, Linda testified through tears, especially family. Even when he knew Thomas had stolen from him, he wanted to give his brother a chance to make it right. He was going to confront him, to offer him help if he needed it. He thought they could work it out as family. He never imagined his own brother would kill him. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Michael was officially cleared of any suspicion. The district attorney issued a public apology for the flawed investigation. The insurance company paid out Richard's policy to Linda and her daughters, where it belonged. $5 million to help them rebuild their lives. The embezzled money was recovered from Thomas's hidden accounts and returned to the company, which Michael now ran with the help of new partners he trusted. Detective Foster resigned from the Denver Police Department, but agreed to testify at the trials of the other corrupt officers Thomas had bought. His testimony led to 6 additional arrests and a massive internal investigation that cleaned house in the department. He eventually took a job with the FBI, using his experience to help investigate police corruption in other jurisdictions. On the day Thomas Davis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Michael and Jennifer came to my house. We sat at my kitchen table, that same oak table where this nightmare had started 3 months earlier, where I'd first seen those insurance documents and known something was terribly wrong. Emma and Tyler were with them, my grandchildren, 9 and 7 years old. Seeing them walk through my door, their faces bright and innocent, reminded me exactly why I'd taken all those risks. These children deserved to grow up with their father. They deserved bedtime stories and baseball games and daddy-daughter dances. They deserved a future that didn't include visiting their father in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Tyler ran up to me first, holding a drawing he'd made at school, a crayon picture of our family, with me drawn as a superhero with a cape. "Grandma, you're a hero," he announced proudly. I looked at that child's artwork, at the pure love and admiration in his eyes, and I had to blink back tears. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew their daddy had been in trouble, and Grandma Dorothy had helped. Emma hugged me tight, her small arms around my neck, and whispered, "Thank you for saving Daddy." "Mom," Michael said, taking my hand in both of his, tears in his eyes, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life. You proved my innocence when everyone else had already decided I was guilty. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." "That's what mothers do," I said simply, though my own throat was tight with emotion. "We protect our children no matter how old they get, no matter what it takes. I brought you into this world, Michael. I wasn't about to let some murderer take you out of it." Jennifer hugged me tight, holding on like she never wanted to let go. "You're the strongest woman I know," she whispered. "The smartest, the bravest. You took on a killer and won. You took on corruption and won. I can't believe you did all this." "I'm 65 years old," I said, feeling every year of it now that the adrenaline had worn off, but also feeling stronger than I ever had before. I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't smell right. And I wasn't about to let some entitled rich man destroy my family just because he made bad business decisions and didn't want to face the consequences. We talked for hours that evening, Michael and Jennifer and I. We talked about the investigation, about the trial, about how close we'd come to losing everything. We talked about Richard, remembering him not as a murder victim, but as the friend and partner he'd been, the good man who died trying to do the right thing. "I'm going to make sure his memory is honored," Michael said. "I'm renaming the company Davis & Associates Consulting in Richard's honor, and I'm setting up a scholarship fund in his name for kids who want to study business or finance. His daughters, Sarah and Michelle, they should see that their father's legacy is about more than how he died." That night, after they left, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sunset over the Denver skyline through my window. I thought about everything that had happened, about how close we'd come to losing everything, I thought about Richard Davis, who'd been murdered for doing the right thing, for refusing to let his brother get away with stealing. I thought about Thomas Davis, who'd let greed turn him into a monster, who'd killed his own brother and tried to destroy an innocent man to cover his tracks. I thought about Detective Foster, who'd found the courage to stand up to corruption despite his fears and his mistakes. I thought about Sarah Mitchell, the lawyer who'd fought fearlessly for justice. I thought about Jennifer, who'd brought me those insurance documents even though she'd been terrified of what they meant. But mostly, I thought about the power of persistence, of refusing to give up even when everything looks hopeless. I thought about the importance of trusting your instincts even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. I thought about fighting for the truth no matter how difficult or dangerous the path becomes. I'm just an ordinary woman. I spent 40 years helping people find books in a library. I bake apple pies. I watch Wheel of Fortune. I play bingo on Thursday nights with friends I've had since high school. I'm nobody special, nobody important, just a 65-year-old widow living in a modest house in the suburbs. But when my family needed me, when my son's life hung in the balance, I became something more. I became a fighter, an investigator, a detective in my own right, a mother who would go to the ends of the earth and back again to protect her child. And I won. A few weeks after the sentencing, I visited Linda Davis and her daughters. I'd been nervous about it, unsure if they'd want to see me, if my involvement in exposing Thomas would be too painful for them. But Linda had called and invited me, said there were things she wanted to say. Their new home in Colorado Springs was smaller than the house where Richard had died, but it felt warmer, more lived in. Photos of Richard were everywhere. Him with the girls at their softball games, him and Linda on vacation, him accepting some business award. Linda was keeping his memory alive for their daughters. "Mrs. Johnson," Linda said, hugging me at the door, "you gave us something I never thought we'd have. The truth. For 6 months, I lived with this narrative that my husband died in a stupid accident, that he'd been careless somehow, that there was something I could have done differently. But you proved it wasn't an accident. You showed me that Richard died fighting for what was right, standing up to his brother's crimes. That's how I want Sarah and Michelle to remember their father, as a hero, not as a victim of his own carelessness." We sat in her living room, and the girls showed me their school projects about their father. Sarah, the older daughter at 15, had written an essay about integrity and courage, using her father as the example. Michelle, 13, had created a poster about justice and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who make the biggest difference. "Our teacher said your story is inspiring," Michelle told me. "She said you proved that you're never too old to fight for what's right." I left their house with tears in my eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. Because sometimes, the greatest weapon you have isn't physical strength or money or power or connections. It's wisdom. It's life experience. It's the knowledge that comes from living 65 years on this earth and learning how to spot a lie, how to follow a trail of evidence, how to ask the right questions, how to never, ever give up on the people you love. Thomas Davis underestimated me because I'm older, because I'm a woman, because I look harmless in my comfortable jeans and my reading glasses and my sensible shoes. He thought I'd be easy to intimidate, easy to fool, easy to dismiss. That was his fatal mistake. He learned too late that underestimating someone based on their age or appearance is a fool's game. He learned that mothers will move heaven and earth to protect their children. He learned that wisdom and experience can be more powerful than any amount of money or influence. I hope he has a lot of time to think about that lesson in his prison cell. As for me, I went back to my normal life, back to my book club and my bingo nights, back to baking pies for family gatherings, back to being an ordinary grandmother who spoils her grandkids and watches too much reality TV. But at book club, Margaret Williams always introduces me as Dorothy Johnson, the woman who brought down a criminal empire. At bingo night, my friends ask me to tell the story again, even though they've heard it a dozen times. When I walk through the grocery store, people recognize me and nod respectfully, sometimes stopping to shake my hand and thank me for standing up for justice. Michael's business is thriving now. He's hired several new consultants, expanded into new markets, and the company's reputation has actually improved after all the publicity. Turns out that having your business partner's killer brought to justice and clearing your own name in the process is good for credibility. Jennifer started a blog about the experience, about what it's like to watch someone you love be falsely accused, about the importance of never giving up hope. It's become surprisingly popular, and she's heard from dozens of families in similar situations, offering them support and connecting them with resources. Emma and Tyler are doing well. They're young enough that the whole experience will fade into a vague memory as they get older, but old enough to have learned an important lesson: that family protects family, that truth matters, and that Grandma Dorothy is not someone to be underestimated. I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream about hiding behind that sofa in Richard's empty house, about hearing that man talk about demolishing evidence. I dream about the coffee shop confrontation, about Thomas's face when he realized he'd been caught. I dream about all the things that could have gone wrong, all the ways this could have ended with Michael in prison, or me dead in a staged accident. But then I wake up, and I remember that it turned out okay. We won. Justice prevailed. And I go downstairs to my kitchen, that kitchen where this whole adventure started, and I make coffee and maybe start an apple pie, and I feel grateful for every single ordinary moment. But I know now what I'm capable of when it matters. I know I'm stronger than I ever imagined. And I know that no matter what challenges come my way in the future, I can face them with courage and determination. Because I'm Dorothy Johnson. I'm 65 years old. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a widow, a retired librarian. Now tell me, what would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. Thanks for watching the video. And don't forget to check out the one that appears on your screen now. I'm sure it will surprise you.